Welcome to Order Before Modern Systems. Here, we explore how everyday order functioned before modern systems, institutions, and formal rules existed. This channel examines how routine, habit, and shared expectations shaped daily life long before modern organization took form. In every community, people need a shared sense of what is acceptable. That shared sense is what we often call normal. Normality is not just about habits or tastes. It works like a practical system. It helps neighbors predict each other's actions, settle disagreements, protect property, raise children, and decide who can be trusted. Before modern police departments, large court systems, and professional investigators, everyday order depended even more on what the community treated as normal. Many rules were not written down. They lived in customs, expectations, and routines. Communities created boundaries around behavior, and they enforced those boundaries using social pressure, local meetings, religious authority, family responsibility, and small local courts. This video explains how communities collectively defined normality across historical periods. It looks at how people learned the rules, how boundaries were set, how violations were handled, and how these practices connected to crime, justice, investigation, and punishment. Normality as a social agreement. Normality begins with shared agreement. It is not always spoken out loud. In many places, people did not say, "This is normal." They showed it through repeated behavior, how they greeted others, how they dressed, how they worked, how they married, how they mourned, how they traded, and how they spoke. A community's idea of normal had several layers. First, there were basic rules for safety and property. These included not stealing, not attacking neighbors, and not damaging shared resources like fields, paths, wells, or grazing land. Second, there were rules for fairness in daily exchange. People needed to trust weights and measures, prices, promises, and the basic honesty of trades. Third, there were moral and family rules. These governed marriage, sexual behavior, childcare, and household authority. Fourth, there were status rules. Many societies expected visible differences between social ranks, genders, ages, and occupations. Normal behavior often meant acting according to one's place. Finally, there were religious or sacred rules. These defined what was pure, clean, proper, and respectful to the divine. All these layers worked together. When most people followed the same patterns, life felt predictable. Predictability lowered conflict. In that sense, normality was a public resource. How people learned what was normal. In modern life, many rules come from written laws, schools, and official policies. In earlier periods, people learned normality mainly through observation and correction. Children learned by watching adults. They learned how to speak to elders, when to be silent, how to behave in worship, and how to work. They learned what clothing was proper for their household status, and what behavior was expected from a boy, a girl, a servant, a parent, or a neighbor. Newcomers learned through daily feedback. In a small village or neighborhood, everyone noticed patterns. If a person acted differently, others might respond with jokes, warnings, avoidance, or direct confrontation. Communities also taught normality through rituals and repeated public events. Weekly worship, seasonal festivals, market days, public meetings, and communal labor all provided a stage where expectations were visible. You could see who stood where, who spoke, who served, who gave orders, and who received charity. Over time, these patterns trained people in the community's shared boundaries. Religion often strengthened normality by giving it moral weight. A practice was not only how we do things, but also how we should do things. In many places, religious teaching connected daily behavior to ideas of sin, duty, and salvation. This made social expectations harder to ignore. Normality and group identity. Normality also helped define who belonged. Communities often created a sense of us by maintaining shared habits. This could include language, food rules, marriage practices, hairstyles, clothing, and religious customs. Even small differences mattered. A person who did not follow local ways might be treated as suspicious, untrustworthy, or disrespectful. In many historical settings, identity markers were not just personal choices, they were community signals. Clothing, for example, could mark rank, occupation, or moral standing. In some times and places, governments passed sumptuary laws meant to limit what people of certain classes could wear. These rules tried to keep social lines visible. Even when such laws were not enforced perfectly, the idea behind them shows how strongly people linked appearance to social order. The result was a simple principle. Normality was a way of making social boundaries visible in daily life. The community as an enforcer, informal social control. When someone crossed the boundaries of normal behavior, the first response was often informal. Informal enforcement included 1. Gossip and reputation. Gossip is not only entertainment. In small communities, it functions like information sharing. People learn who pays debts, who fights, who cheats customers, who drinks too much, who mistreats family, and who cannot be trusted. Reputation affected business, marriage chances, and neighborly help. Because survival often depended on cooperation, reputation was a powerful tool. Through public criticism and shaming, a neighbor might correct someone directly. A group might confront a person at their home. In some communities, people used ridicule or insults to push someone back toward accepted behavior. Exclusion. A community could punish by refusing help. If someone was seen as disruptive or dishonest, others might not trade with them, might not hire them, might not invite them to gatherings, or might avoid marriage connections. Pressure through family. Because households were economic and social units, families often carried responsibility for members' behavior. Family elders might discipline younger members because the entire household's standing was at stake. These methods were not equal to modern legal rights and procedures. They could be unfair and could target unpopular people. But in terms of function, they were low-cost enforcement tools. They worked quickly and did not require paid officials, from informal pressure to organized local justice. When informal pressure failed, communities used more organized systems. These systems differed across time and place, but they often had a shared pattern: local responsibility. Instead of relying on a distant government to investigate and solve every problem, local groups had duties to present offenders, report wrongdoing, and maintain order. In parts of medieval England, for example, there were systems that organized men into groups with shared responsibility for good behavior. In such a system, if someone was suspected of a serious offense, the group could be required to produce the person to face local justice, or the group could face penalties. This kind of shared responsibility encouraged neighbors to watch each other and to prevent trouble before it grew. The point is not that every society used this exact model, but that many societies relied on collective responsibility. The community itself was part of the enforcement mechanism. Community investigation. Before professional detectives. Modern people often imagine investigation as a job for trained specialists using forensic tools. Earlier communities investigated differently. Investigation often began with direct observation. In small communities, many acts were witnessed. People lived close together. Work was public. Markets and worship were gathering points. Because everyone knew each other's routines, unusual events stood out. When something happened, investigation relied on witness statements. People told what they saw. Memory and local knowledge mattered. Local reputation. If a person already had a reputation for theft or violence, suspicion focused quickly. Physical signs. Tracks, missing items, damaged property, and other visible signs could guide a search, even without modern science. Community pursuit. In some legal traditions, there were formal expectations that bystanders help pursue a fleeing suspect. This shows that investigation and enforcement were partly a civic duty. This model had strengths. It was fast. It used local knowledge. But it also had weaknesses. It could lead to quick assumptions. It could be influenced by personal conflicts, class power, or prejudice. Local courts and the regulation of daily life communities also define normality through local courts and local officers. In medieval and early modern Europe, many places had local courts that handled everyday problems, small theft, assaults, public disorder, trade offences, and disputes over land or debt. Local courts often acted less like modern criminal courts and more like community management. They aimed to restore order, collect fines, and keep daily life running. One important feature was regulation of trade standards. Bread, ale, and other staples were central to survival. If sellers cheated, people could starve or become sick, so communities developed systems to check quality and fairness. Local officers might test or inspect goods. Local courts might punish sellers for false measures or poor quality. This type of regulation shows something important about normality. It included economic trust. Normal behavior was not only about personal morals, it was also about honest dealing. In such systems, punishment often came as fines rather than long imprisonment. Fines served multiple functions. They punished wrongdoing, compensated authorities or victims, and funded local administration. Public humiliation as a tool of enforcement. Many pre-modern communities used public humiliation as a punishment. The logic was straightforward. If reputation mattered, then harming reputation was a penalty. Public punishment also reminded the public of the boundary between normal and unacceptable behavior. Public humiliation could include being placed in stocks or a pillory, being paraded, or being forced to announce wrongdoing in public settings. Some punishments were gendered. Certain forms of public humiliation were aimed especially at women accused of scolding, sexual misconduct, or disorder. This reflects how communities define normality differently for men and women. It also shows how enforcement often protected existing power structures. The function of public humiliation was not mainly to remove a person from society, but to correct and reintegrate them, or to mark them as untrustworthy if they refused to change. Collective rituals of disapproval. In some places, communities used collective public rituals to express disapproval. These events could involve loud noise, mock parades, and public ridicule aimed at a person accused of breaking important social expectations, especially around marriage, sexual behavior, or household order. These practices were not random. They followed local traditions. They were often timed with festivals or public gatherings. They blended enforcement with public display. From a systems perspective, these rituals did several things. They told everyone what behavior was unacceptable. They demonstrated collective unity. They pressured the accused person to change. They allowed the community to act without needing a formal trial. At the same time, they could be abused. They could target vulnerable people. They could punish behavior that was not harmful in a legal sense, but was simply unpopular. Purity, pollution, and the boundaries of the social body. Many societies have treated certain things as unclean or out of place. These ideas were not only about hygiene. They were about social order, rules about food, bodily fluids, burial, sexual behavior, and contact with outsiders often created strong boundaries. When someone crossed these boundaries, they were not just breaking a rule. They were seen as disturbing the community's order. Purity rules help define normality by sorting the world into categories: clean versus unclean, permitted versus forbidden, inside versus outside, sacred versus ordinary. This sort of classification helped communities manage fear and uncertainty. It turned confusing events into rule-based systems. It also gave moral meaning to social boundaries. Normality and hierarchy. Normality has often been tied to hierarchy. In many historical societies, normal behavior meant accepting a ranked order, nobles above commoners, masters above servants, men above women in many legal contexts, elders above youth. The enforcement of normality often protected these rankings. Status rules were reinforced by dress expectations. Speech rules, like who could speak first, seating arrangements in worship or public meetings, rules about who could carry weapons, marriage expectations, economic restrictions, including guild controls in some towns. When people violated status rules, the response could be strong, even if no one was physically harmed. That is because these societies treated visible hierarchy as part of social stability, normality, violence, and the limits of community control. Not all problems could be managed through social pressure or fines. Serious violence, repeated theft, or organized banditry often required stronger action. Communities sometimes formed groups to pursue suspects. In other cases, they turned to regional authorities, lords, sheriffs, or royal courts. This is where the limits of community-defined normality become clear. Local systems worked best when people knew each other. The population was stable. Most disputes were small and repetitive. Authorities were nearby. Local consensus was strong. They worked less well when there was rapid migration. There were large anonymous cities. There were deep class conflicts. Powerful offenders could intimidate others. There were religious or political divisions. As societies grew larger and more complex, states expanded their role in defining and enforcing normality. This did not remove community influence, but it changed the balance. The growth of formal institutions and normalization. In the modern era, many societies developed institutions that trained people to meet standards: schools, armies, workplaces, hospitals, and prisons. These institutions often measure behavior and performance. They rank people, correct them, and record their progress. In this setting, normality becomes something that can be defined by official standards rather than only by local custom. This creates a different kind of boundary system. Instead of relying mainly on neighbors watching neighbors, institutions create routines of observation and evaluation. Historically, this shift did not happen overnight. It was gradual. But over time, a larger share of daily regulation moved from informal community pressure to organized administrative systems. Still, even in modern life, communities continue to define normality in powerful ways. Social expectations at the neighborhood level, workplace level, and peer group level continue to shape behavior, sometimes even more strongly than formal law. How normality connected to crime and justice. In pre-modern settings, the line between crime and wrong was often less clear than it is today. Some actions were clearly criminal: theft, assault, arson. But many behaviors were treated as offenses because they disturbed order, even if they were not major violence. Examples included public drunkenness, disruptive speech, sexual behavior outside accepted norms, selling bad food, breaking market rules, insulting a neighbor. This shows an important point. Communities often treated order itself as a protected value. Justice systems were designed not only to punish violence, but to keep daily life stable. In many local courts, the goal was not long-term incarceration. Instead, the system relied on fines, oaths and promises, public acknowledgements of wrongdoing, temporary restraint, restitution, shame-based penalties. These methods fit societies where prisons were limited, travel was hard, and the economy depended on maintaining a working population. Normality as a negotiation, not a fixed rule. It is important to understand that normality was not fixed forever. Communities argued about boundaries. Different groups had different interests. Young people pushed against elders. Workers pushed against masters. Women and men navigated separate expectations. Religious minorities often lived under different norms. Poor people and wealthy people did not face the same enforcement. Even when a community seemed united, there were disagreements about what was truly acceptable. Over time, changes in economy, war, disease, religious reform, and migration could reshape what people treated as normal. For example, after major population changes and economic shifts, people often worried about social order. Authorities sometimes responded by trying to control dress, food, and consumption. In other words, when society changed quickly, rules about normality became a tool for restoring visible stability. A practical summary of the system across many historical periods, communities defined normality through a working system with several parts. Part 1. Shared expectations. These came from tradition, religion, economic need, and hierarchy. Part 2. Everyday teaching. People learned rules by watching, repeating, and being corrected. Part 3. Informal enforcement. Reputation, gossip, ridicule, and exclusion kept many people in line. Part 4. Collective responsibility. Households and local groups were often expected to control their own members and assist in enforcement. Part 5. Local justice. Courts and officers handled daily offences and regulated trade and order. Part 6. Visible punishment. Public penalties made boundaries clear and aimed to correct behaviour. Part 7. Escalation. When local methods failed, communities turned to higher authorities or used stronger force. This system did not always produce fairness, and it did not protect everyone equally. But it did create order in a world with limited formal policing. What normal really meant. When we say a community defined normality, it can sound like a simple cultural preference. Historically, it was much more than that. Normality acted like an operating manual for daily life. It was a way to coordinate behavior in crowded spaces, protect scarce resources, and manage conflict without constant violence. In places without modern law enforcement, the community's idea of normal was a form of governance. It decided what counted as a problem, who had the right to correct it, what evidence mattered, and what punishment seemed appropriate. Understanding these systems helps explain how people maintained order for centuries without the institutions many modern societies now take for granted. It also helps explain a lasting truth: formal laws matter, but the everyday boundaries of acceptable behavior are still shaped by communities through shared habits, shared standards, and the steady pressure of social life.